Доброе утро. Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for coming today. My name's Fraser McQueen. I'm a mining engineer with SRK Consulting. Been working for SRK for about 5 years now, mainly working in open pit mine planning, undertaking feasibility studies and strategic option studies. I've done lots of work in Kazakhstan in the past 2 years and Russia also. And before working for SRK, I used to work in Zambia with First Quantum Minerals, working at their copper gold project at the Sentinel mine. So today I'm going to be talking about, for the next hour, how to undertake pit shell selection for open pit optimization. So this is a brief overview of what we're going to be talking about for the next 45 minutes or so. We're going to have a quick introduction, followed by we're going to talk about how companies define their strategic objectives and how that influences selection of pit shells. We're going to talk about the inputs which go into pit optimization, and then we're going to use a case study to go through the general process of how you generate and select the optimal pit shell which meets your objectives you've defined. We're going to talk a little bit about undertaking pit designs based on those shells and how there is often a variance between what is designed compared to what is contained within the optimal shell from the software. We're going to also talk about having a variety of different inputs and how that influences the value of a project through the concept of the hill of value. Then we'll have a few other considerations, a bit of a summary, and then hopefully some time for some questions at the end. So what do you hope to learn over the next 45 minutes? So we're going to learn what pit optimization is used for, how to analyse the results of the pit optimization, the methodology that you should use for selecting the shell that is appropriate for your mine plan, and then things that you need to look for to avoid and things that you should try and be careful of when you're undertaking this process. So let's just dive straight in. So pit optimization fundamentally is to understand the physical and economic characteristics of the deposit. And with that information and with that understanding, decisions can be made. There's a variety of different uses for pit optimizations which are stated in the centre here, for example mineral resource estimates, life of mine plans and feasibility studies. And this information that we're sort of looking for through the optimization process is the shape and size of the shells, the economic characteristics, for example discounted cash flows, also the sensitivity to the inputs, for example if prices go up, what happens to the shells, and if costs change, what happens to the shells. We also want to identify the highest value areas of the deposit, because these are the areas we should be targeting first. So the question that we need to ask ourselves at the beginning of this process is, what pit shell should we select for our mine plan? And it really depends on what you want to achieve. There is not one simple answer. So therefore, you must understand your objectives before you start the process of pit optimization and shell selection. So how do you define objectives? So an objective is used to define when a plan that you have developed is optimal. Now these objectives are normally provided to planning engineers by managers or senior roles. And there's a list here of a variety of different typical objectives which we come across during our studies. We won't go through them all in detail, but they're just useful for reference here. A couple of ones which are key ones to note are value of a project, which may be measured in NPV, or net present value. Now for those that are not familiar with net present value, what we're discussing here is it's the value of the project discounted over time to take into account the time value of money. There are other things here, for example, mine life. You may think, well, we have a minimum mine life requirement of, say, 4 years, but we don't want to have a very extended long mine life of, say, 15 or 20 years. We want to constrain it. Or something that is frequently seen in either Russia or Kazakhstan is to try and maximise the size of the deposit, to try and maximise the amount of contained metal. That can also be an objective. Now, different company objectives require a different plan. So for each of these objectives, you may require a slightly different plan. Now, this diagram here represents how some objectives can only be achieved by sacrificing others. For example, with the blue outline, we can see here that the plan has tried to maximise the MPV of the project, but has therefore not been able to maximise the ore reserve or the size of the deposit. Equally, on the orange area, we can see that the objectives here have tried to reach a specific product specification. This may be a concentrate grade or some other variable that required to sell the product. But therefore, we've had to spend more capital costs, for example, and therefore we've moved away from achieving the lowest capital cost option. So it's always a balance of objectives. It's also important to recognise that different people within the company have different objectives. For example, people that are working in production roles may have shorter term objectives, something within maybe a month or 6 months or 1 year objectives, whereas longer term planning engineers may have objectives which span maybe 2 to 5 to 10 years. So it's important to try and understand, to align the objectives of the people that are making the plans at site, which are generally shorter term, compared with people that are making the plans in the offices or the head offices, which have got much longer look-ahead times normally. So the key thing here as well is to understand that it's important to communicate the objectives within the company to make sure everybody understands what we're aiming towards. So here we have a list of general technical inputs which are used for pit optimization. Now, we're not going to go through each of them in detail. They're just used here for reference. But it's important to note that depending on the point at which you're undertaking the study, the inputs will have different levels of confidence. For example, if you're undertaking a scoping study, very early stage, you may have a low level of confidence in the inputs. And then when you get closer to feasibility and production, you have higher confidence in the inputs to the pit optimization. So it's important to understand the context of the results of the pit optimization relative to the level of detail and confidence that you have in the inputs. An important thing to note here is the pit optimization process tries to optimize on a parameter or an objective. Now, if the parameter or information is not included in the optimization, for example, if the processing recovery is not included in the block model, you cannot optimize using that input. So in order to run the optimization fully, you must have all of the inputs and parameters included either in the geological model or available, for example, as a recovery curve or some other form of input. One parameter which the pit optimization process uses is something called the revenue factor. Now, in the generation of the pit shells, the optimization software will vary the price that you have input into the optimization and will change it by a factor. For example, here we have a base price for gold for $1,250 per ounce. And the optimization software will vary the price, shown here in 0.1 fractions, and that will affect the size of the resulting pit shell. Now this revenue factor process is how the optimization software generates a variety of shells for you to analyse. So this is useful for you to understand when we're later in this presentation referring to the different revenue factors for each shell. It should become clearer later when we show some diagrams and some more tables. So we're going to use a case study now to go through the process of pit optimization and shell selection. Now this is it's actually a real deposit, but it's been moved in space and had the grades changed, but it does represent a real ore body. So the case study we're going to look at is for an open pit scoping level optimization in order for a company to evaluate the potential value and size of the project. So if we imagine this fictional company has decided to sit down with the management team and define some strategic objectives. The objectives that the company... Oh, sorry, apologies, I haven't skipped forward for this slide. So there are a number of strategic objectives which are stated here for the company. The company would like to maximise the discounted cash flow for the project. It would like to reduce the risk of the project with relative to price changes. It would like a minimum mine life of 5 years at 2 million tonnes per annum, which effectively means they're looking for 10 million tonnes of ore. And they'd like to understand the optionality for future cutbacks in the future, if the economics in the future are favourable. They also want to understand maybe to guide our future exploration drilling programme. So the outputs from the pit optimization process that we're going to look at in more detail shortly normally come in the form of an Excel results table that will have a series of different information in it. The physical pit shells generated from the optimization process. And then it's very useful to have a discussion on the results. What do the results actually mean? Because we can look at the numbers, but to have a discussion understanding, and that will really allow us to make the decisions. So the key areas that we're going to be focusing on are the discounted cash flow, strip ratio, incremental strip ratio, different costs and operating margins, resource utilisation or the size of the pit shell, and then we're going to look at the sensitivity to lower confidence material, referred here as inferred material. So what the pit optimization software does is it generates a series of shells, which are represented here in this diagram by the black lines, moving from the higher grade or higher value areas of the deposit on the right, which are coloured in red, moving towards the lower value areas of the deposit coloured in blue. The pit optimization software varies the price and therefore generates different sized pit shells at each of the price that is input. Now, the software will provide some discounted cash flows for you to analyse for each of the shells. It will provide a best case cash flow and a worst case cash flow. It's important to understand what the software means when it's referring to best case and worst case. So, best case reporting of cash flows is when the pit shells can be mined in a series of very thin slices, moving from the highest value area of the deposit to the lowest value. Now, this provides the highest cash flow because it defers the waste stripping requirements as much as possible. But actually, in reality, it's normally not practical to mine like this, because you can't physically mine very thin slices of deposit from top to bottom. So this provides the highest value, but is probably impractical. The other option, which the software outputs, is the worst case scenario. Now what this does is, this essentially takes the pit shell and mines from top to bottom in all benches. So each of the black lines is mined at the same time. So it mines the entire deposit from top to bottom. This does not allow the deferral of waste stripping and does not specifically target the highest value part of the deposit first. Now this normally underestimates the value of a project because it mines lower value material at the same time as higher value. But this is practical, this option. Now in reality, you will mine probably a combination of the two. You'll mine some areas via shells at the higher value part of the deposit, and other areas will have to be mined by benches to make sure it's practical. So the cash flows that we're expecting to see in reality will be somewhere between the best and the worst case. And that's a very useful guide for looking at the results of the optimization to making decisions of which shell will actually provide us the highest value. A way that we look at this is we actually normally take the average 50% of the way between the best and the worst case cash flows. So this chart here represents the amount of ore in the grey bars contained within each of the shells that are generated at different prices. So for example, on the left-hand side of the chart, we have lower price shells. These are the shells that are generated when the gold price is low. And for example, you can see that when the price is between $500 and say $800, the shells are small. They have a small amount of ore. This is because this part of the deposit is only economically viable when the prices are between $500 and $800, so the shell is small. Then when you increase the price, the size of the shell can increase because it can target either deeper ore at a higher strip ratio or lower grade ore. And therefore we see an increasing quantity of ore and an increasing size of pit shell as the price increases. Now, the blue, black and red lines represent cash flows generated in each of the shells. So the blue line represents the undiscounted cash flow. So the cash flow that has not been discounted in time. You can see that it increases and peaks at the $12.50 shell. Now this is because we used $1,250 as the base price in the optimization. We can see here that we have the black line represents the best case cash flow, discounted over time. So this black line represents if we could mine the deposit in a series of very thin slices, like an onion skin, then this is the cash flow that could be achieved. Now this cash flow peaks at the $1,150 shell. But we already know that this shell is unlikely to be practical because it can only achieve these cash flows when mined by very thin slices. Then we have in the red line, we have the worst case cash flow, discounted. This represents the cash flow generated when you mine the deposit bench by bench. So it's practical, but it's probably underestimating the value of the deposit. And it peaks at the $1,000 shell. So what we're interested in is understanding which shell should we select if we're trying to maximize value in a practical way, whilst achieving the other strategic objectives, which were approximately 10 million tonnes of ore, and to leave optionality for future expansions, and also de-risk the project relative to changes in metal price. So the cash flow, 50% between the worst and the best, peaks at approximately the 1,100 pit shell, represented here by the green bar. And as we can see, the amount of ore is above 10 million tonnes and achieves the maximum discounted cash flow that is practical. So what we're going to look at in the next few slides is these 4 highlighted shells in a bit more detail, so we can understand the physical and economic characteristics of these shells, and then make a decision on which one we should select for our mine plan. So it's difficult to visualize things sometimes by looking just at charts and numbers. So this is a cross-section through those 4 selected pit shells that we highlighted before. And they show the topography and the geological model, colour-coded by gold grade. And we've indicated here which of the shells is which. So the first thing to note is, spatially, where do these different shells sit? We can see here that the worst case scenario shell, highlighted in red, is the smallest shell. And then as the shells expand, they become deeper, target lower grade and deeper material, and expand towards the north, including more waste material. So the red shell, which is the worst case, actually targets the highest value part of the deposit. If you were going to mine one area of the deposit first, this should be the target area, because this gives you the highest returns. It has the highest margin. And as we move towards the larger shells, you have more waste stripping requirements, and therefore the return, the value of that deeper ore is actually less. So you have a reducing returns as you expand in the shell size. Also, there is higher risk associated with mining the larger shells, because you have higher waste stripping requirements. Now, if in the future, for example, your operating costs go up, you will have to spend increased quantities of cash mining that waste before you actually reach any of the ore. So you'll have to mine significant amounts of waste before you can reach the ore at the bottom that will provide the revenue. So now we're going to look at the inventories, the amount of ore contained within these shells, and we can look at some trends and look at some more detailed information. So here from left to right, we're looking at the smaller shell, which is the worst case, and moving to the larger shells towards the right. We can see here that the grades generally decrease as the shells get larger, although you have an increasing quantity of ore. So you have more ore at a lower grade. This results in higher metal content. Now if we look at not just the ore, we start looking at the total rock quantities, including the waste. We can see that the total quantity of rock increases as the shells increase in size. The ore tonnage increases, but also the waste quantity significantly increases. We can see here that we go from the worst case shell has approximately 48 million tonnes of waste, and it almost doubles to about 84 million tonnes of waste. So you're doubling the amount of waste for a 60% increase in ore tons, but at lower grade. You can see that the stripping ratio increases as you move from the smaller to larger shells. So the risk is actually increasing as you move from the smaller to larger shells. Now, if we look at that in terms of what it does to the economics, if we just look purely at the cash flow, not discounted in time, we have an increasing quantity of cash flow. And that's to be expected because you've got more ore and you've got more contained metal. But when you start discounting these cash flows over time, you can start to see that perhaps the larger pit shells may not actually provide the highest value of the project. So if you focus on the average case, discounted cash flow at the bottom, which is the practical, achievable discounted cash flow, it actually peaks at the 1,100 pit shell and then decreases as you get larger. So what this is telling us is that even though you're increasing the size of the pit and increasing the amount of metal, you're not actually adding any value to the project, and in fact you could be damaging the value of the project. So the recommended shell from this analysis, from our perspective, to achieve the objectives would be the 1,100 pit shell. The majority of the value is actually contained within the 1,100 pit shell, and the discounted cash flow plateaus and then decreases after that. The 1,100 pit shell has 32 million tonnes less waste compared to the 1,250 shell. It has a lower strip ratio and improved margins, and actually has a lower incremental cost per ounce. Now what that means is, for every ounce that you are mining, it costs you less to mine and extract that compared to the larger shells. It also has lower risk, because even if the prices reduce from $1,250 down to, say, $1,100, everything within that pit shell is still economic. It also provides options for the future. The company may say, well, look, we'll mine the 1,100 pit shell first, and then in the future we can always expand when prices increase or if costs decrease to the 1,250 pit shell or larger in the future. So it leaves optionality open. It also achieves the other objective of providing the 10 million tonnes of ore required for the minimum mine life. So this is like a typical sort of analysis that you might undertake. You would look at the data in a tabular way, and you'd also look at the data spatially, so you can make spatial decisions to see if it makes sense. And then the next step you might say is, well, let's look at the influence of the geological confidence levels. So the pit optimization we were just talking about was run on what you might call either measured or indicated classified mineral resources. So these are the resources which could be included in a study to upgrade to ore reserves, for example. But it's important to understand, what about the lower confidence material, and where should we target our exploration? Where should we look at maybe drilling some more exploration holes? So this pit optimization shell represented here in the orange is targeting the measured and indicated portion of the deposit, and it's at the $1,800 shell, so it's quite a large shell. This is a high price shell. And this is targeting the green part of the deposit, which is the higher confidence area. Now the blue shell is an output from the optimization when it includes inferred material. This is the deeper material, lower confidence. And you can see here that the blue shell dips into the blue inferred material at quite significant depth. Now, what this tells us is that unless prices rise significantly above $1,250, into the region of maybe $1,800 or higher, the inferred material is not economic. It's at such depth that it requires such large amounts of waste stripping that it is unlikely to be economic unless prices rise significantly. So what does this tell us about our exploration program? It says, well, if you were to target the inferred material and try to upgrade its confidence, that material would only be economic at much higher prices. So perhaps we should spend the money on the drilling somewhere else. Maybe we could either target a shallower deposit that we might have nearby, or we could also target the indicated material within the green zone and increase the confidence of that material, because that's more likely to be mined earlier. So looking at the results of the optimization spatially and plotting the key information, for example, the block model color-coded by mineral classification, is very important to understand the physical and economic characteristics and help you make those decisions. So this next couple of slides, we're going to talk about moving from a theoretical pit shell, which doesn't have any ramps or geotechnical berms or anything in it, and we're going to talk about how you move from the shell to a practical pit design that can actually be implemented. So, in order to include the geotechnical information, which my colleague will be talking about a bit later, into the optimization process is normally an iterative process. You'll run a preliminary optimization at an assumed slope angle that is reasonable for the rock mass. You'll undertake a preliminary design by looking at where the ramps might go and the batter berm configuration. You'll take that design and check it against the pit shell, and also provide that design to the geotechnical engineers to do an analysis. And if there's any variance from the pit shell to the design, you may have to re-optimize. You will then have to redesign and then check again whether the pit design matches the shells and also meets the geotechnical design criteria. Now, normally 1 or 2 iterations is sufficient for this, but in complicated projects, I mean, I've seen it sometimes where there has been a large mountain which has been mined, or at least cut through, with large high walls, which have required 4 or 5 iterations of pit optimization, analysis and design just to get it right. So the key thing here is the interaction between the geotechnical team, the hydrogeological team and the mining design team is critical. And a review of the slope angles relatively early in the project is important. When you undertake a design, it should be relatively close to the inventories of the pit shells, normally within 5 to 8% waste, and preferably within 0 to 5% ore. So this is a cross-section through an optimized pit shell in orange, and a pit design represented in the blue. And we have a topography level above that. So what we can see is that often the pit shell targets the deposit in an ideal way. Now, when you do the design, ramps will have to be included. For example, in the upper areas, you can see that there are flat spots which represent the berms and wider flat spots that represent the ramp locations. Now, these can cause waste to be included in addition. So you have additional waste gains in some areas. And deeper down you can see that the pit design hasn't managed to reach the bottom of the pit shell, so you actually may lose some ore. So, for example, here you may say, well, actually the optimization needs to be redone because this pit shell is theoretical and not as practical as it could be. You may have to change the slope angles in the upper regions of the deposit. Now the re-optimization process at different slope angles could actually change the size of your shell because it will change the amount of waste, and may change which shell you finally select. So it's important to do this iterative process to understand the influences of the additional waste and the loss of ore. Another important thing which to consider, and I've seen it many times where this is not considered adequately enough, especially at operating mines, is the minimum mining width. So we have an existing topography of, say, an existing mine. We've run an optimization and generated a shell, and we've undertaken a design. But we must ensure that the design that we undertake has a minimum offset between the topography and the final design in order for equipment to operate safely. So it's important to check spatially where your optimization shells sit relative to the topography. So now, how are we going to identify the risks to our project? We've undertaken the optimization with a single set of parameters at this point. How should we understand what happens if prices change, or if mining costs change, or if, for example, the geotechnical analysis later in the project shows poorer regions of the deposit geotechnically? So we have to undertake a sensitivity analysis. So we can rerun the optimization process by varying the inputs by certain amounts. And then we can do the same analysis spatially and economically to understand how, for example, changes in mining costs will affect the discounted cash flow of the project, how changes in geotechnical slope angles might change the quantity of waste and quantity of ore, and resulting cash flows for the project. There's a few examples here which I've just highlighted of things that can go wrong during the pit optimization process and shell selection process. So it's important to understand that if you select a shell, you're probably going to mine that mine in a series of cutbacks, preferably moving from higher value to lower value areas. Now it can be that the final cutbacks that are the lower value areas may not add any value to the project, and therefore you should consider maybe leaving those final cutbacks out of your mine plan and only including them as an upside potential for future expansion. This is important because it will influence your pit design process. You must consider when you do the design for your smaller shell that if we want to expand in the future to the larger shell, the ramp locations must be suitable to do so. Other examples which I've seen have been where shells have been selected with very thin slices between the existing topography and the final shell, where actually you physically cannot mine the pit shell. So the design has huge variance from the shell. It expands and includes large quantity of waste in addition. It's also important that if you include inferred material in your pit optimization, you must note that you cannot use that inferred material in an ore reserve statement. They can only be used at scoping level mine plans. Another consideration is the cut-off grade that has been used to define what is ore and what is waste. The optimization software will use your inputs, for example, the costs, the processing recoveries, and the price to calculate a cut-off grade. But the deposit may be very sensitive in that cut-off grade region, for example around, say, 0.5 grams per tonne gold. There may be a huge amount of material which sits between 0.5 and 0.7 grams per tonne. That may cause the shell to be very large because it includes all that low-grade material. But if costs change slightly, or recoveries change slightly, the cut-off grade may rise above that, say, 0.7, 0.8 grams a tonne, and you will lose all of that low-grade material, and the shell will shrink. So it's important to understand the grade distribution within the pit shells. To say, well, do we have lots of low-grade, or do we have lots of high-grade? And is there risk associated with changing costs and prices associated with that low-grade material? I mean, I've seen an example where there have been pit shells generated and 50% of the ore sits within the very low grade bracket. Now we had some updated costs that were provided, we reran the optimization, and the pit shell actually halved in size, and we had to explain, why the pit shell inventories had changed so significantly. It's important to understand these sensitivities early before you may present any results to the public. So far, what we've been talking about is a single set of input parameters to give a single discounted cash flow value and a single set of pit results. Now, there are actually a variety of different inputs which are normally overlooked in the optimization process. These may include processing recovery and throughput curves. Also, cut-off grade optimization is a key technique which is often not used enough. Often there are ways to de-bottleneck a project by spending capital, maybe expanding the plant. Now all of these inputs can be varied in the optimization process, and that will allow you to do a full analysis of the value of the project, normally referred to as a hill of value or option study. So here these diagrams represent where we take a project and the value of the project can increase to a peak. Now, in order to fully utilize and achieve the value of a project, you may have to vary multiple variables or multiple inputs. For example, change the processing throughput and the cut-off grade. So simultaneous changes in inputs can actually achieve significantly higher value. So the optimization must be undertaken on all of the inputs in order to climb the hill to find the highest value of the project. So we're just going to have a quick recap on it. Obviously there's probably a mixed group here, some of which have undertaken pit optimizations before, some may not have. So I understand there's a lot of information that we've spoken about. But really, the things to take away from this is the process of pit optimization and shell selection is to understand the characteristics of the deposit. There is not just one fixed answer. It depends on what your objectives are. And the process enables you to make decisions. So it's important to identify what your objectives are early on in the process. There are some key metrics which you should analyse, which include pit shell size, ore tons and grade, and discounted cash flows. And risks can be identified by varying the inputs and looking at the variance in the results. Now, pit shell selection can either add or significantly damage the value of a project. And it's one of the first steps in undertaking a study. And it's often overlooked, or it's gone through too quickly. So it's important when you're undertaking the shell selections to stop, think about what your objectives are, and really think, does this shell achieve what we want, and does it reduce risk, or is it actually damaging value and increasing risk? And it's important to have clear discussions between lots of departments to make those decisions. So everybody from the geologist, processing engineers, through to the management and even HR. Because all of these shell selection decisions will impact how the mine will develop and then have impacts on all departments. So thank you very much for listening. I hope that's been useful and informative for you. Happy to take some questions now if there's time, and also to let you know that SRK Consulting will be undertaking a 2-day open pit mine planning workshop in Almaty in May, and myself and Alan Blair will be undertaking that. And so if you're interested, we can provide some more information later, but it's on the SRK website. And we've covered a small amount here, which we'll be covering in much more detail over those 2 days. So, thank you very much. More questions? Okay.
Спасибо вам большое, мистер МакКуинн, за содержательный доклад. У меня есть несколько вопросов. Я их могу задать, если есть время, или во время перерыва. Как вы считаете?
Okay.
Okay?
Yeah, sounds good.
You want to take them now or over the coffee break?
Oh, we could do them maybe over coffee break if it's easier.
Если будет проще, наверное, давайте на кофе брейк.
Okay.
Ну, первый вопрос такой, я начну с конца. Мы определили оптимальный вариант, но значительная часть запасов осталась за пределами оптимизации оболочки карьера, и проектом тоже подтверждается, что оболочка карьера выбрана в соответствии со стратегическими целями правильно. Но запасы остались. Что с ними делать?
So I've seen this quite a lot of times, and it's important to identify that extra material which is outside of the optimal shell, as you say, and quantify it. So we can say we can increase the pit shell size maybe by a certain amount, 20, 30, 40%, but it can only be achieved under a certain set of circumstances. That may be that the price has to increase beyond a threshold, or that operating costs have to be brought down to a different level. So yes, I agree. It's very important to note and discuss and tell people that this resource could be larger. But planning that extra material as a base case from which you will do your mine plans can often damage the value and add significant risk. Really, a mine plan that you make this year may change next year, and it may change the year after. So you should always have operating the best plan today, but it may change.
Я понял ваш ответ. Потом возвращаться после повышения цен на металлы может быть даже невозможно. Это карьер уже не вопрос. Вы это понимаете так же, как и я. И причем наше государство, Республика Казахстан, этого не разрешит. Нам надо будет зарабатывать все до конца. То есть с вашей помощью мы должны выбирать другие пути, искать, находить. Я думаю, ничего невозможного нет.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Вы говорили только о карьере, который добывает только золотосодержащие. А если металлов много, то оптимизация производится по каждому металлу и определяется средняя величина по выбранной одной стратегической цели или по полной стратегической цели. Причем они же могут обогащаться по-разному. А на металлы цена высокая. А руды, может быть, такие комплексные, что один металл можно извлечь, другой тяжело извлекать, а цена высокая.
Yeah. So this was a very simple case of just gold and one processing route. But the optimization process can use variable processing routes, so you can have multiple recovery routes and use multiple metals as you state. The process will still be the same of identifying the highest value part of the deposit and identifying the risks with moving to larger shells. And you can actually change the processing recovery for the different metals and look at the sensitivity. So yes, it's very possible to do full optimization studies for polymetallic operations. We have done so relatively recently in Kazakhstan. And all of these parameters can be included. But it's important to note that the geological model must contain that information in order to do the study. For example, if you have a lower recovery region of the deposit and a higher recovery region, that must be coded into the block model, or at least spatially understood to do the optimization. If it's not understood, or if it's just talked about, it cannot be optimized. But if it's in the model, it can be.
Спасибо.
Yeah.
У меня еще один вопрос есть, но он не первый.
Okay, sounds great.
Прежде всего, большое спасибо за содержательный доклад о том, как должны работать инженеры на разных стадиях проектирования карьера, в основном инвестиций до технического проекта. Но, в принципе, эти технологии работы с использованием различных инструментов можно осуществлять. Вопрос такой. Вы нам показали возможности инструмента оптимизатора карьера. В нем вы употребляете такое понятие, как сценарий. В основу любого достижения любой оболочки, которую вы написали, лежит последовательность действий. Она является именно понятием сценария. В тех же оболочках, которые вы показывали, ни на одной из стадий проектирования достичь их невозможно. Тогда вопрос, какой, собственно, смысл в прорисовке этих оболочек, которые дают только общую картину на уровне даже такой слабой анализа морфологии тела. Вот у меня вопрос, все-таки сценарий это что значит? И оболочка это что значит?
Yeah, I understand the question. So, as we said before, this is a very basic representation, just to show the process of selecting the shell from a cash flow point of view. But if you had more information, for example, the different geological lithologies, which had different rock structures and different material characteristics, you could use that information to generate different slope angles, for example. So, by scenario, what we're talking about is the mining sequence. It's a simple way of thinking, what is the highest value sequence that we can actually mine this deposit? We're also trying to look at what is the worst case, but practical. So we're trying to understand, okay, what is the maximum value of the project in theory, and then what is a practical value? Now, it's important to look at the shell sequence, as you say, because we need to look at design. What are we actually going to mine? So, for example, the smaller shells that were generated in the higher value part of the deposit. Oh, sorry, wrong way. Okay. So, in the smaller shells, in the higher value part of the deposit, should be where your initial cutbacks will be designed. And then your next cutbacks, potentially, will be subsequent to those. Now, obviously, there are lots of other factors which may influence the location of where you can mine. There may be infrastructure that exists in one area which you have to avoid. The mining method may dictate how you mine. For example, if you're using conveyor belts with in-pit crushing systems, you may have to install those in certain areas first. Now, that will be a constraint to the mine plan. But it's still important to know that, okay, not worrying necessarily about what specific constraints we have, what is the most high value part of the deposit that we should target early?
ответ, но хотел бы уточнить все-таки. Мы говорим о сценарии, то есть последовательности действий для достижения какой-то оболочки. Вы все время употребляете понятие наиболее эффективных или наиболее экономически выгодных запасов.
Okay.
Но не все запасы экономические самые выгодные. Поэтому их добыча должна быть равномерной во времени. Это достигается сценарием строительства карьера. А вы показываете карьер, который уже отработан, то есть уже построен и уже произведена его эксплуатация. То есть конец отработки. В сумме, наверное, будет какой-то показатель коэффициента вскрыши, какая-то экономика. А последовательность действий вы можете на разных этапах строительства карьера получить разные экономические эффекты. У вас будет период экономики, высокий коэффициент вскрыши, низкий коэффициент вскрыши. Но это понятно любому проектировщику. Как этот алгоритм помогает действиям инженеров по разработке проекта карьера принимать решения, поскольку здесь показан только какой-то гипотетический карьер на конец отработки. Мы в своем докладе про сам алгоритм действия или про работу программы ничего не рассказали. А вот как бы результаты его действия, результаты.
Yeah. Okay. So the design is completely, it's a manual operation. So we undertake the designs in 3D CAD software. So what we'll do is, for example, if I was to undertake develop a mine plan, which required designs, I would do the pit optimization. It would tell me the sequence of the shells from the highest value to lowest value. If it's an existing mine, for instance, I would look at where the ramps sit and say, well, okay, I need to target, say, this part of the deposit first. It has higher value. So I will take the shell and I will physically design that shell into a pit design, which will have ramps, batter and burn configurations with the input from the geotechnical and hydro teams. And then I will design the final pit. Then I take these designs and I will schedule within them. Now, actually, before we do the designs altogether, the next step in this process will be to actually do a strategic schedule. So we'll pick, say, a shell in the centre that will be a first cutback, a starting point. We'll have the final pit, which sits around it. And we can run a schedule inside, which will mine the first cutback first, and then mine the second cutback. And that will give us our stripping profile over time, and our ore, and our grade. And will also give us other outputs. For example, if we have the recovery in the block model, we can output the recovery. So we then have the schedule of the theoretical shells, which we can then take, do the design, and then do a detailed schedule to give us, down to maybe monthly or quarterly resolution of information. Now this overall plan can then be provided to a mine site as a strategic plan, and the planners at site can take this plan and make it into their short or medium-term and short-term plans. So it's one scenario, as you say, but it includes everything from identification of the value of the deposit, the mining sequence in terms of which areas you will mine first, and also, as you say, it's a wider input, it's a wider set of information that has to come into this process, because as you develop the pit, you'll have more information from geotechnical, more information from hydro, you may have more information from the processing guys, so it's an ever-evolving process.
То есть на сегодняшний момент это алгоритм, который позволяет художественно отобразить какое-то месторождение, не технически. Это художественное, так сказать, дизайн. А денежные потоки и экономический эффект, он на уровне общих соображений.
No, it can be a good representation of the deposit and the value of a project. It is, if you put technical inputs which you have a good support for, if you've done, for example, a good quality geotechnical study, a good quality processing recovery study that gives you representative samples from different parts of the deposit, you know that your resource model has got good confidence levels, then the mine plan you can develop, it's a technical mine plan. It is illustrative in the sense that you can show things in 3D and look at spatially, but it's important to say that it's a spatial plan that is supported technically. You're right, if you put poor quality inputs in, based on just thumbsuck numbers or things that are not based in reality, then the plan will not be practical and you will never achieve the results that are shown. But if the inputs are real and well measured, then you can produce a very practical and technical plan. And at this point in the development of software and algorithms, this is the starting point. This is currently what is used for good practice internationally. Now there are other more sophisticated programs available to us which can do more complex analysis, for example, varying cut-off grades over time, making stockpiles of material in the schedule, and then rehandling that material later. And all of these parameters can be used to develop a fully technical plan.